In the previous classes, we have already learnt about processes, then various process models such as waterfall model, iterative model, prototyping model and spiral model. We know that all these process model contains various phases. The first phase is the requirement analysis phase, second is the design phase, third is the coding, fourth one is implementation. So, we will study about all these phases detail. First of all, we will learn about the first phase, that is requirement analysis and specification. Let us start our discussion on the requirements analysis and specification. This is an important phase in software development. It is the first phase towards software development. Before we start discussing requirements analysis and specification, first let us try to answer the question that what is a requirement. A requirement is defined as a capacity, capability or condition required from the system which to be developed. A system typically consists of many capabilities and conditions. For example, if we are developing a library software, then the capabilities may be we can create books, we can create members, we can issue books, return books, and the conditions may be that to be a web-based software and so on. Let us see in more detail. We can define roughly that a requirement is a capability or a condition that is required from the system. A capability is a facility that the software provides to the users. For example, the users can issue book, return book, etc. Each of that is a capability of the software. And the condition is not really a facility provided, but then it is more general purpose. For example, it runs on, it's a web-based software and so on. As we proceed, we will be able to understand what are the capabilities, how to identify and what are the conditions that are required for the system. Now, let's see how to go about doing the requirements analysis and specification. What are the main activities that are involved to carry out requirement analysis and specification? The first work that need to be done is to understand what really the customer has in mind. We will have to gather the requirements from the customer. Hopefully, the customer has all the requirements in their minds. We need to gather this by meeting the customer and using few techniques. Those techniques we will discuss later, and then we need to analyze what we have gathered from the customer. As we gather the requirements, it can have several problems. By analyzing, we will identify what are the problems and how to overcome them. There are two aspects here. One is understanding the requirements and the second one is about specifying the requirements. If you are developing a very small toy problem, then the requirement specification is extremely easy because the issues are rather clear and we can specify those. But then for an industry standard problem, the requirement specification is typically the hardest among all the phases. It is the most problematic and error prone among the development tasks, and it is important to note that any requirements error has a huge cost overhead, unlike a coding error or something which can be quickly corrected. A requirement error costs maximum, and during requirement specification, the input is the user needs. Hopefully, the users understand what are their need together to analyze and remove problems from need and then document that. And at the end of the requirements analysis, we will have a precise treatment of what the software will do. and this is documented in the form of SRS document, software requirement specification document. So we have been saying that requirements are there in the client's mind and we need to gather it and document. But what about the case where a company wants to develop a generic product? That is some product which may be useful to people, that are generic products. In this case, there is no specific client here. The company wants to develop something hoping that there will be many buyers for it. For example, a company might like to develop a health embedded product which will monitor various health parameters and give feedback to people. Let's say you are the customer who want to purchase the product. It can be purchased by anybody who likes it. But then for development purpose, who will the customer? Who will give the requirements? Typically, it is a salesperson who understands that what will sell well. What features are typically required would be demanded by the customers, and they act as the clients for the software and they actually need the requirements. Now, let us try to understand in more detail the activities carried out during requirement analysis and specification. As we are saying that the first is requirements gathering, because the requirements are there in minds of the users. There are some techniques to do it, and once requirements are gathered, start doing the requirements analysis. But during requirements analysis, we might find that there are some requirements which are missing, which are not clear, and so on. We need to again meet the client and more requirement gathering, and then more requirement gathering. And once our requirements task is complete, we go for specification and then document the requirements, and the final outcome is the SRS document. So there are three main activities are here. Requirements engineering, three activities are here: requirements gathering, requirements analysis, and requirement specification. All these are carried out because even though one is complete, we need to revisit it if required during the analysis and specification. We can also represent it in more elaborate way. After the feasibility study, the project have been found feasible, then the requirements gathering started. This is the iterative work, because once we do the requirement gathering, we start requirements analysis. But then we might find that need to do more gathering, need to resolve issues, and to do requirement specification. But then during requirement specification, we find that there are still requirements problem, and might do requirements analysis and again do requirement gathering. So these all are the iterative set of activities, and at the end of the requirement specification, we have the SRS document. Now let's look these three activities in more detail. Requirements gathering. Here the requirements are there in the minds of the clients. We need to understand the requirements, and then we need to analyze the requirements and remove problems from the requirements. For example, are there any inconsistencies, anomalies, and so on. We need to check all these factors, and then we do the requirement specification, where we document the requirements that we have gathered and analyzed. Let us try to understand the requirement process. That is, what are the activities that are undertaken and how these are accomplished. Here the requirements gathering starts with the user needs. We gather the requirements and then analyzed it, but then we might have to go back to gathering. And then once this is done satisfactorily, the gathering is complete and the analysis is satisfactorily complete, then we proceed to the specification. But during specification also we might do some analysis and may need to do gathering if we notice a problem during writing down or documenting the requirements. And once the SRS document draft is produced, it is reviewed by the customer to check whether all the requirements have been captured, and all reviewed by the development team members whether these have been written sufficient detail and so on. The testers also reviewed to check whether the testing or the test cases can be satisfactorily designed based on the requirements that have been written down in the document. And once the review is done, then SRS document is produced. It is important to understand here that this is not a series of stages, rather it consists of a lot of iterations. Lot of iterations are required because during analysis you might realize that some problems need clarification from the customer. We need to do gathering, are some requirements missing, and during specification also we might need to do some analysis and gathering. Now let us try to see how to do the gathering. This is the first task in requirements process here. There are many techniques that are typically deployed. We need to use multiple techniques for gathering requirements. We will take up case study, simple case study to see how it can be done. The first is that if there is an existing manual or there is an existing software which is something similar to the one that we are developing, we need to study that. Let's say an office work needs to be automated. We need to first observe that what work is exactly done in the office. If the software exists which is similar, we need to use it and check what all facilities it is provided and where all we want changes. And once we observe all the work, we need to study the procedures. How this work is carried out. For this we need to discuss with the customer and the end users. Also need to input and output analysis. That is, we need to do input and output analysis. Now let us say there are some forms that are input. Take the example of an office. If the students and the faculty need to fill some forms and submit to the office, those are the input. We need to study what are the types of forms that are being used for input and what output office produce, and then what are the forms they use to producing the output. What are exactly the data that is input and the data that is output by the office. And based on this gathered requirement, we decide what exactly need to be done. The gathering activity typically contains 4 steps. One is study existing documentation. The second is interview. We need to interview the end users and also the customer who is involved in the software development. The third is called as task analysis, that is based on the interview. We first identify that they use it for certain tasks. They plan to use it for performing certain tasks. And then we need to do the task analysis to find out what are exact procedures based on which the task accomplished. And then for each task we need to do the scenario analysis. That is, each task consists of multiple scenarios. For example, let us just take a simple case of a student in the office of a department. The students can take leave. One is that the student fill up a form, give it to the office or get it approved by the head of the department and give it to the office. This is just one scenario. The taking leave can have multiple scenarios. For example, they want to take medical leave or they want to take a semester withdrawal and so on. So there are the different scenarios where they might have to do a slightly different procedure. even though the task is applying for leave by a student that can have several scenarios. And the fifth technique to gather requirements is the form analysis. In the form analysis, the input form and the output form are analyzed to find out what are the data that are input and what are the data that output. So, 5 well-known requirements gathering techniques are studying existing documentation, interview the end users and the customer, task analysis, scenario analysis and form analysis. If you want to do requirements gathering for any project, these are the 5 tasks that typically need to carry out. Now, let's take up a single case study and try to understand how these activities are carried out. Of course, many times the customer does not understand the problem well, and here it is the responsibility of the person who is gathering the requirements suggest to the customer what features might help and what would be useful. The person should have a lot of imaginations and creativity. Requirements gathering, even though it appears like a simple task, but it requires a lot of experience, because this is the crucial task need to gather all the requirements from the customer who has some of the requirements in mind. The person doing the requirements gathering not only should have communication skill, but should have imagination, creativity and experience. Now let us do a case study. Let's say the computer science department has an office which is operating right now manually. There are 2 office clerks, a storekeeper and 2 attendants. Their main work is to keep track of the academic records, the inventory of different equipments and so on, and also the financial information in the department. Now, the head of the department just asked a team of student members to develop office automation work. Now, let's see how the student members of the development team went about gathering, analyzing and how they specifying the requirement. They select the most experienced person, the student having good communication skill to carry out the requirements gathering. They met the head of the department first and then try to identify what exactly is required. So, the head of the department is the customer here, and then they met the office clerks. They are the end users, because finally they will be using the software. From the end users, they gathered what are the tasks that they do every day and they would like to automate. They met with other users like students who right now manually submit forms. Later, they would have to submit it through the software to develop. So, their expectations of the software also need to gather. They interviewed the students and faculty who are also the stakeholders and the users of the software. This task that was achieved by meeting the head of the department, office clerk, the students and the faculty. They identify in what way the user will use the software, what is the expectations of the software, what features will be required. All these are interviewed tasks. After identifying the task, they try to identify the steps through which these will be performed and then identify various scenarios that may arise for each task. Then they do the task and scenario analysis. They collected various types of forms that are used by the office. They collected filled form from the users, that is student, faculty, etc. and also collected the forms that office users used to produce any output. All these are the form analysis. And then the student members who were carrying out the requirements task, they looked at the requirements gathered, identified inconsistencies ambiguity and incompleteness. All these are the requirements problems. And they identify the problems and overcome them by discussing with the head of the department. And then they went about documenting the requirement specification, that is the SRS. So, in this case study, we have prepared an SRS and complete the process.